Collide 4 was one of the most talked about modules of 2024. It's a collaboration between Joranalogue and the musician and YouTuber Hainbach, and it's inspired by the lock-in amplifiers used in vintage nuclear test equipment. They call it a Quadrature Spectral Computer, and while that might sound complicated, Collide 4 is actually made up of elements that will probably be a bit more familiar: a preamp, an oscillator, some filters and ring modulators. What makes Collide 4 special is the design of these elements, the way they interact, and the open-ended patching possibilities that they offer. You can use it as a stereo complex oscillator with through 0 FM for beautifully soft and organic tones. You can ping the filter on the input stage and use it for powerful kick drums and percussion. You can ring modulate pings with the oscillator to create metallic techno riffs. Or you can explore rich, heavily modulated stereo drones. You could use the variable bandwidth filter with an external VCO for unique acid-style sounds. You can breathe new life into basic drums with frequency shifting. And you can process acoustic sources to create fascinating new harmonies. Joranalogue sent me a Collide 4 to check out back in October, but rather than rushing a video out, I wanted to take a few weeks to properly get my head around it and avoid getting too swept up in all the hype. And just to be fully transparent, Joranalogue gave me the module, but if I didn't genuinely like it, I would have given it back and not made a video. In the video, I want to show how I've been using Collide 4, both as a sound source and as a processor for external signals. I'll show some softer musical applications alongside some grittier stuff. As with a lot of Joranalogue gear, some of the terminology on Collide 4 might be unfamiliar at first, and it definitely doesn't spoon-feed you in any way or try to lead you down any particular sonic path. But if you're prepared to put in a bit of time to research and experiment, you'll discover all sorts of ways to use it. Before we get into the patches, I'm going to attempt to explain what Collide 4 actually is and walk you through the controls. There's a fair bit of talking in this section, so if you're already familiar with Collide 4, then do feel free to skip ahead to the patches using the chapter markers. As I mentioned, Collide 4's design is based on lock-in amplifiers used in test equipment. These are designed to detect very small voltage fluctuations in noisy signals, and they work by locking onto a frequency in that signal, filtering it out, multiplying it with a reference signal, and filtering again to leave a DC component. Now, I don't think many of us are planning to use Collide 4 to measure activity in a particle accelerator, so you might be wondering what any of this has to do with making music. It took a while for the penny to drop for me, but I think the point is that the individual components of a lock-in amplifier are all building blocks that are commonly used in synthesis. By recreating a lock-in amplifier in Eurorack form with a few key changes, Joranalogue had provided a really useful set of tools for making and processing sounds, even if you're not using it for any of the purposes a lock-in amplifier is traditionally designed for. Collide 4 essentially has three sections: an input stage with a preamp and filter, an oscillator with a pair of balanced modulators or ring modulators, and an output section with various computed signals. Let's start with the input stage. Down here is the input, and right away there's something unusual. In true test equipment style, this is a differential input, so there are two inputs, a positive and a negative. These are basically summed with a negative input inverted. Now, I must admit I haven't found a use for both of them yet, and I've only been using the positive one, but I'd love to hear your ideas in the comments. The knob at the top left sets the preamp gain in 10 dB increments, from off via unity to 30 dBs of gain. It can deal with just about anything from Eurorack level down to contact microphones. The ping input generates a transient to excite the input stage and lets you ping the filter, as you'll soon hear. Next, the signal passes through a variable bandwidth resonant bandpass filter. There are controls for the filter's center frequency, the width of the band, and the resonance, all with corresponding CV inputs. There's a switch to choose whether the center frequency is set freely or whether it tracks the frequency of the built-in oscillator, which I'll come on to in a moment. The filter self-oscillates at high resonance and it pings beautifully. Finally, in the input section, there's a VCA with a CV input and attenuverter. Unlike most VCAs, this one is designed to amplify rather than attenuate, and it can add up to 60 dB more gain with the knob, or a whopping 100 dBs via CV. There's a big overload indicator at the top left which shows when any part of this input stage is being overdriven. The monitor output lets you patch directly from the end of this input stage. As you'll see in one of the patches, this section on its own is a really characterful preamp and filter, but we're really just getting started. Next up is the oscillator section. This is a quadrature sine wave oscillator with two outputs that are 90 degrees out of phase. It's really a pretty straightforward analog VCO. There's a switch to choose the frequency range, LFO or audio, there's coarse and fine tuning controls, a volt per octave input, an exponential FM input with an attenuverter, and a through zero linear FM input also with an attenuverter. The only thing that's slightly unusual is the oscillator symmetry control, which determines the range over which the through zero FM occurs. In the centre, the oscillator will stop and it will only start again when FM is applied. The individual outputs of the oscillator are available at the I and Q outputs. I and Q stand for in phase and quadrature. Then we get to the real meat of Collide 4, a pair of balanced modulators, which are also known as ring modulators, bipolar VCAs or 4-quadrant multipliers. These basically multiply the output of the input section with the outputs of the oscillator, and the results are available here at the X and Y outputs. You can also patch directly into both sides of each balanced modulator with the X, Y, I and Q inputs down at the bottom, but by default they'll work on the input stage and the internal oscillator. With this switch set to the X equals Y position, the same signal from the input stage is fed to both balanced modulators. With it set to this 90-degree position, the input stage is passed through a Hilbert transform network, also known as a dome filter, which results in two versions that are 90 degrees out of phase. This lets you move beyond simple ring modulation and into frequency shifting territory using these X minus Y and X plus Y outputs, which are the sum and difference of the two balanced modulators. One is the downshifted version and the other is the upshifted version. There's a time constant knob here which controls a pair of non-resonant two-pole low-pass filters that come after the balanced modulators. This also has a CV input and a range switch, and it can be used for shaping or softening the sound further. Finally, there are two more outputs, magnitude and phase, which treat the X and Y signals as coordinates in a 2D plane and compute the distance and angle from a central point. Don't worry too much about the maths of any of this, I just think of these as useful extra outputs for distortion and feedback patching. Just bear in mind that the magnitude output is always positive, and the phase output is usually pretty extreme. So apologies, that was a bit of a theory dump, so without any further ado, let's start patching so you can hear what some of this stuff actually sounds like. So let's get started by pinging the filter on the input stage, because I think these kind of filter ping sounds are really key to what makes Collide 4 special, especially when you're using it as a sound source. We're going to listen at first to the monitor output, which is just the output of the input stage. That's going to be attenuated and run through the green trace on data so we can see what's happening as well. The filter itself I've set to free mode with the center frequency near the middle, maximum width and minimum resonance. No extra gain added after the filter either at the moment, but I'll come to that in a minute. If we just increase the resonance, as it gets to the top it starts to self-oscillate and we get this pure sine wave. And if we back this off to just below that self-oscillation point, it will now respond to pings at the ping input. So I'm going to take the step output of step 8, I'm going to feed a clock in here to clock this. We're not going to do anything with the sort of CV output yet, the scan output, just the pings to start with. So the pinged filter sounds like this. So it's not huge amplitude, but we can play with the decay time, effectively going from very short little clicks to slightly longer ones. And if we add a bit of gain, we can approach the point where it starts to overload. If you watch the overload indicator at the top left, and it starts to square off. I'm just going to attenuate it down slightly on the way into data to stop it doing any nasty clipping. But we can get this quite nice kind of range of tones here. I can play with the tuning, of course. So the resonance is our decay time, effectively, and the gain is kind of the wave shape from sine to something a bit more square. Let's keep it around here. And I'm taking the scan output of step 8, which are these kind of the CV sequence. That's going to the volt per octave of the oscillator. We're not listening to that oscillator at all yet, but we can set the filter frequency to track that oscillator. So if I flick to track, we now have a pitch sequence. And I've also got some stepped random, which I'm going into the gain CV input here. So this is the kind of filter gain, the VCA that comes after the filter, which is kind of designed to overload it. I just add a smidge of that step random, back off the gain slightly. Means we'll get these kind of distorted accents. Quite subtle, but it kind of makes the sound feel a little bit more alive. So let's just take out that monitor output for a second and listen to these X and Y outputs, which I've panned left and right. So these are the result of the balance modulators, or the ring modulators, or bipolar VCAs, multiplying the two phase shifted outputs of the internal oscillator with that filter ping sound. So I've got the X equals Y switch set, so that input stage ping is going to both balance modulators, and they're 90 degrees out of phase with each other coming out of the oscillator. So we're getting these kind of ring modi tones, which in stereo are quite nicely spatialized. And of course, anything we do on the input stage here will kind of be reflected at these outputs because it's being multiplied. Let's just add a kick drum to this. And let's bring the monitor output back in. So I've got the monitor panned centrally and these X and Y panned left and right. And the tuning relationship between this input filter and the oscillator is quite key to the sound here as well. If I play with this tuning, we can get up to these kind of percussive kind of hits. This sounds quite nice for a kind of techno groove. It's also quite fun to feedback patch. I'm going to take the phase output here. I'm going to go into the through 0FM, linear FM input of the oscillator. Just add a smidge of this. That's this extra kind of layer of grit. Here is a low-pass filter on these X and Y outputs as well. We can kind of filter some of that higher end out. That will also have an effect on this phase signal. So yeah, as a kind of sound source, this pinged input ring modded with the internal oscillator I think is a really interesting sound that's quite hard to patch up with other modules. So this input stage of Collide 4 makes for a really interesting kind of combination preamp and filter when it's just used by itself. You've got loads of gain in the preamp stage and it overloads really nicely, and then this variable bandwidth bandpass filter design is a really interesting one. I've been having a lot of fun feeding in saw waves from an external oscillator and using it as a kind of gnarly 303 style filter, which is what I'm going to show in this patch. I've got a sequence from TB3PO in Ornament and Crime here, which is a kind of 303 style sequencer. That's driving an external oscillator. I'm taking a saw wave there to the input. I'm taking the monitor output from Collide 4, attenuating it slightly and running it through the scope. It'll be the green trace on data here. Contour 1 is our only envelope generator. At the moment, that's just being used to open the external VCA. I'm not modulating the filter at all. I've just got these controls centered, no resonance, and the input gain is just below overload. Let's hear what the sequence sounds like on its own. So we're just getting this kind of nice bandpass filtered saw wave kind of sound. If I play with the width and the filter center, we can get that kind of narrow band kind of effect. Let's just add a bit of resonance. You get a load more character straight away. That resonance is causing this amp stage to overload slightly as well, which is sounding really nice. You can add even more gain there. See, it kind of squares off that wave. Let's just take it down a fraction. Let's add a bit of envelope modulation as a filter. So I'm going into the filter center via this attenuator with a copy of the Contour 1 envelope. So I'll bring that up. So the envelope shape has quite a pronounced effect now. Let's also modulate that filter width with an attenuated LFO. I've got filter 8 in LFO mode up here. So it's just a slow LFO. Just going to add a little bit of modulation just to kind of open and close that filter bandwidth. And let's add some drums. And tweak the sequence slightly. Now of course with a bandpass filter like this, depending on where you are in the spectrum, you do lose quite a lot of the low end. So I've taken the sine wave from the same oscillator, that's the blue trace on data, and I can mix that in just to reinforce the kind of low end of that bass line. Yeah, really nice kind of characterful acidy filter stage here. Here's a little interlude to show you what frequency shifting sounds like on a human voice. Make sure the Hilbert transform switch is in the 90-degree position and you'll get upshifted and downshifted versions of the input at the x minus y and x plus y outputs. The oscillator frequency controls the amount of shifting. What you just heard was me bringing in the upshifted output, mixing that in with the unprocessed sound and adjusting the frequency. Now I'm going to take the dry sound out. You can hear that things get pretty extreme quite quickly. Now I'm going to bring in the downshifted output. As I play with the frequency, notice how they get further and further away from each other. Now let's try running a CV sequence from step 8 to the oscillator frequency to vary the amount of shifting as I'm speaking. Yep, that's definitely pretty wild. So yeah, frequency shifting is a lot of fun, and Collide 4 makes it very simple to do. So if you've seen many other demos of Collide 4 by now, you'll probably know it's a pretty awesome kick drum synth or percussion synth when you ping the input. I'm going to design a kick drum with a pinged input section, and I'm going to use the phase output to design a second layer of percussion to complement the kick drum. So to get us started, let's get a trigger pattern going into the ping input, and I'm listening to the monitor output, which is going through the green trace on data. I've got the resonance just below self-oscillation. I've got a little bit of gain, so it's just overloading very slightly. And by playing with the resonance, we can control the decay of that kind of booming tone. Playing with the gain, you can square that off. But most kick drums sound a bit better with a pitch envelope at the front to give it a bit of attacking transient bite. So I've kind of multed the same trigger pattern to contour 1, generating a really snappy exponential envelope. I'm attenuating that through select 2 and then going into the filter center. So let's just bring in a bit of that envelope. And you'll hear straight away we get this kind of transient at the start now. And by playing with the amount of that envelope, the length of that decay with the resonance and the gain, there's lots of sweet spots to be found. Also, the envelope has quite a big impact here on the shape of the envelope, so I can make it less exponential or more exponential, and longer decay times get us into this kind of disco tom territory. Let's just go down here and bring in just a little bit of bite with the gain. Now I'm taking the phase output, which is being processed through the oscillator and the transform network side. The phase output is generally pretty aggressive and noisy sounding. So I'm going to use a 16th note trigger pattern with another short snappy envelope opening another VCA. And let's just bring that up. So this is the phase output. We get this nice kind of, by playing with the oscillator frequency, got a good range of metallic, slightly hi-hatty kind of sounds, sort of tuned percussion. Where this gets really fun is if we take the magnitude output and go into the exponential FM, and now we're going to get these kind of pitch changes that are related to the kick drum and give us this much more dynamic. So yeah, loads of fun to be had with Collide 4 as a drum machine. So here's a bit of a happy accident that I discovered while playing around with Collide 4 as a frequency shifter with different input sources. I've got this cheap old kalimba with a contact mic taped to it, and the input stage of Collide 4's got enough gain that you can plug a piezo like that straight in and boost it into a usable level. So the clean signal from the monitor output, just boosted in gain, not filtered at all, sounds like this. So just a fairly straightforward clean tone. Obviously I'm not a very good kalimba player and it's not a very good kalimba, but hopefully you get the idea. And with the frequency shifting, I just stumbled across, almost accidentally really, a frequency which produced an octave downshift on that low C. So if I mix in the X minus Y frequency shifted version, this middle C is about 260 Hz and I dialed in about 130 Hz on the oscillator. So when I play the two together, the monitor output mixed with the X minus Y, and play this low C, we'll hear an octave below it as well. We'll hear a kind of two-note chord. If I just take out the high note, that's the downshifted version. Now, because frequency shifting isn't the same as pitch shifting, we're not going to get that clean octave interval with any other notes. What we are going to get is whatever their frequency is with 130 Hz subtracted. But the way it works out with some of these other notes in the same kind of scale, we get some nice intervals anyway. So if I play the E and G, for example, and the F, so now these single plucks of the kalimba are giving me these nice kind of 2-note chords basically. And I thought this would sound quite nice piped through good old clouds or monsoon. So let's add a bit of granular effect and a big dose of reverb. Next up, I want to explore using Collide 4 as a stereo oscillator with some through 0FM. I'm not going to use the transform network or the balance modulators at all in this patch. I'm just going to take the direct oscillator outputs, I and Q. They're running through the scope here, and as you can see, they're just pure sine waves which are 90 degrees out of phase with each other, which means they work quite well for stereo effects. So they're going to come through that scope into natural gate, which is just off screen, and I'm going to use rung divisions here to generate a little sequence, kind of Turing machine style. I'll have some occasional transposes from the DAC, and I've got slightly different gate patterns going to the left and right sides of natural gate, and I've panned those almost fully hard left and right, but not completely fully. Let's get the sequence going. So already quite a nice LPG sine wave sort of tone with a little bit of left and right variation, and if you're listening on headphones or in stereo, you should hear a fairly rich stereo field for this one. I've got the input stage of Collide 4, I've got the kind of preamp turned off, but the filter, I've got the center and width roughly centered, I've got the resonance max, which means it's self-oscillating, and I've got it to track the pitch of the oscillator. So if I take the monitor output, which is basically that self-oscillating filter, go into the through 0FM, so I'm just self-patching it here, and bring up the depth of through 0FM modulation, we get these nice kind of classic through 0FM style tones. We can play with that filter center relative to the pitch of the main sequence, or relative to the pitch of the oscillator rather. Dial in a relationship that works well. If I turn the tracking off, it's just modulating it at a constant frequency, so it's quite nice to track it. It keeps it sounding a little bit more musical. So as a through 0FM oscillator, it sounds pretty nice. Let's just experiment a little bit more. I'm going to take another output from rung divisions, a 3-bit output, which is another kind of CV sequence effectively that's related to the main pitch one. I'm going to attenuate that through select 2, and I'm going to modulate the center frequency or the pitch of the modulating oscillator, in this case the resonating filter. Let's just bring in a little bit of this. So we're now diverging in pitch from the main oscillator slightly, which gives us these nice kind of more atonal sounding, but really nice kind of experimental West Coast style tones. Again, I can turn the tracking off. Which is also quite nice in this case. And this is one of those ones where just a really small amount of modulation, taking these attenuators right back, just leads to this really organic, warm sounding, pinged sine sort of tone. So to finish, I'm just going to use Collide 4 to build a really rich, heavily modulated stereo drone, which is one kind of sound that it really excels at. To start, let's just listen to the monitor output with the filter self-oscillating at quite a low frequency. And I've got a sequence on step 8, but rather than controlling pitch, I'm going to feed that into the gain modulation and basically kind of sequence the amount of gain And if you watch the level indicator up here, we get this nice kind of sequenced distortion or sequenced drive as this sine gets kind of progressively more and more squared off, which is a pretty cool sound. And now let's listen to the X minus Y and X plus Y outputs, which are these kind of ring modulated, which I've panned hard left and right. I've tuned up the built-in oscillator a bit higher, so we're getting quite a nice effect there as well. And we can add a bit of modulation from step 8 from some of these individual steps. I'm going to take the analog output of this 6th step and control the frequency. That's control the center frequency of the filter, so pitching up the sequence of that step. And I'm going to take a couple of the gate outputs from step 8 and I'm going to go into the through 0 FM just for a little kind of weird pitch glitch on that step. And if we go into the exponential FM with the step 1 gate, just needs a tiny amount to vary the tone on that note. And let's bring in the monitor again, which is the lower pitch. You can also take that exponential FM the other direction. That sounds pretty cool. And the time constant, which basically acts as a low-pass filter on these ring-modded elements, kind of take some of those harsher edges off. But let's take a slow LFO from filter 8 up here and just go into the time constant, which will just give us a slow filter sweep over that. So I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully this video has given you a bit of a taste of what Collide 4 can do. I really do think it's one of the most interesting Eurorack modules released for a long time, and I feel like I'm still figuring out all the things it can do. If you've enjoyed the video, then leave a comment, like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.